A warm welcome back to the channel. My name is Tom, and you're watching youtube.com/GetNuanced. And in this video today, I'd like to read an article that I found pretty interesting on The Intercept by the author Naomi Klein. The link to this article will be in the video description below, but the topic is titled Screen New Deal, and it's about how Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, is basically giving a prelude in his recent press conference to the future developments of how the technologies, especially like remote learning when it came to the pandemic, and how many were forced to transition those who could or had obligations that were based around traditional brick and mortar settings where people would gather in mass, where in light of the pandemic, obviously that's no longer a possible or a safe reality that could even be entertained. So in light of that, obviously, they started doing things that were able to be done in a way over the internet, such as schoolwork for the grade school students, which I was one at one point in New York. And I can still remember that actually too, only graduating about 5 years ago, actually, which is pretty crazy as of June. And I spent my last year, actually, though only a month or two actually, in Tampa after moving. But I spent the majority of my childhood basically attending school in New York. And it's just something that I can't get over. The fact that now, the way that I went to school, the way that many millennials my age, I was born in 96, right on the cusp between the millennial generation and Gen Z, but many people within my overall age group, had went to a brick and mortar school where classes of 30 kids would gather, and there'd be one teacher, maybe two teachers, depending on the class. And you would have that sort of like real life face-to-face interaction where a teacher, whom unfortunately in a lot of ways were many of them, some of them were good, but a lot of them are overglorified babysitters, where they would be in the front of the class. They would be doing some sort of iteration that they've configured of the curriculum, which halfway through my experience had transitioned into that nationwide Common Core nightmare, which could make an entire video on how bad that is, and how standardized testing, I think, since I was in third grade, had been something where I was just used to taking every year. And then there was the New York State Regents in high school, which all these different tests, which are supposed to assess people's intelligence, I think do a pretty piss poor job when it comes to really measuring and actually deriving meritable results when it comes to understanding the millions of students, at least in New York City, who are taking these tests and actually gauging their worth when it comes to intelligence, which is not something that you could really just derive from solely the number that you get on a piece of paper after some sort of exam, where these questions written by people that are no better than these students themselves, who are learning, who have just as much to learn still. And I think that when we realize the nature of these tests, the standardized testing, and the racket that College Board, many of these other like textbooks distributors, these school really has, and at least in the United States, been, as long as I can remember, really a business. And maybe the public schools are a little bit different than the private schools, which a lot of those private schools really are just cash cows for those who can afford to own colleges, which if you are, sure, if someone's watching it, which I doubt they are, they're making a killing. But even in public school itself, a lot of the schooling, especially in New York City, when Michael Bloomberg was mayor for 3 terms, which was not great. I mean, he was all right. I mean, not the worst mayor, but at the same time, he had mostly thought it would be a good idea to place business leaders in charge of creating education curriculums, thinking that you could run schools like you could run a business, when the reality is educating youths and running some sort of like corporation, those are really just different things that require a different mindset for both, when it comes to actually creating an environment in both where things are actually good and not just like a parody of what they should be. But, I could go on forever with Michael Bloomberg. That's another topic for another day. But when it comes to Andrew Cuomo, who has been governor of New York for quite a while, his father actually was governor in the 80s and 90s, I believe, Mario Cuomo. He was actually considered at one point a hot contender for running for president. And it seems, from what at least Andrew Cuomo has been saying recently, which I don't really trust him, honestly, and nor do I trust most politicians, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. I mean, party labels, affiliations, and just all that type of stuff is really just a formality when it comes to trying to get people to be convinced that we live still in like some sort of representative like democratic republic, when the reality is for such a long time now we've lived in an oligopoly. And if people like Andrew Cuomo, it seems like if they're going to get their way, we're going to slowly also become a full-blown just overt technocracy. And I mean, it's only just encapsulated in the fact that Cuomo had during this recent press conference, the CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, I think, he had joined the press conference live on webcam, on video, and had basically said that him, along with other people such as the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, all these other, technocratic types who obviously are smart in their own right, but, again, you can be an intelligent business leader. That doesn't really necessarily mean you're a good educator or someone who should be in charge of crafting the curriculums that children are learning, and getting them to be passionate about learning and actually making the most of this education, rather than it just being a way for these companies and the government to just, kind of indoctrinate people and make money off of their unknowing of the facts, and basically from their inception being conditioned to think that the current structures of the system are just the way that they are. They can't really be questioned or changed, but just something you got to conform with, which I never really agreed with. And maybe I didn't have a way in which I was able to kind of articulate that way back when I was a kid, but it really never rubbed me the right way that when, so to speak, that when I was going into elementary, middle, and high school. Elementary school for me personally was definitely not as bad as middle and high school, both of which I am very glad that they're over with. But I think most kids are that way too. I mean, but the system, at the end of the day, is not oriented towards having people be critical thinkers. It's more towards creating either just, kind of people that act more like that NPC meme, the non-playable character, more like drones. And that even includes those within the managerial class. There's been so many people I used to go to school with, no names obviously, but people that just obviously were intelligent, but their intelligence was derived from the system structure. They're basically the aspiring managerial class, which will soon, be running the bureaucracy in Washington, heaven forbid. People like Pete Buttigieg, who are pretty awful and shitty. And then there's also, those other types that are going to be the future titans of industry, or the inheritors of those. And even the new money from Silicon Valley, these, people that would probably endorse or vote for a candidate like Hillary Clinton or Elizabeth Warren, these people whom are, at least socially, they claim that they're liberals, but on an economic and just, I'd say cultural level, they're just pretty, just degenerate and just, I think, not as great as they think that they are. Some of them, listen, at the end of the day, I might want to just create broad brushstrokes and just generalize, but a lot of them, because of their upbringing and because of their just, maybe upper middle class kind of upbringing, I think their worldview, a lot of times, like a lot of people, even on the other sides of the political aisles, whether you're left or right, people tend to orient themselves towards believing things initially, like their ideology, or maybe even if they're not political, their point of reference is based off of their own experiences. And sometimes if you're that type of person and you're just basing things off of your personal experiences, that's not putting into account alternative people who have had alternative experiences in the same sorts of situations, and also other factors such as people who have had to deal with a lot more than you have, or have had to go through something that was traumatic. Or, listen, and even these people have traumatic experiences. They might have the death of a loved one, or maybe not having their political candidate or social cause prevailing. Those types of things. But at the end of the day, they tend to find it difficult to really rationalize, or not rationalize, empathize with more working class or lower class people who are just as human and American as the rest of everybody else, but at the same time do not have the representation or the wealth or the status to really have a strong constituency that, or have a representative that will actually represent their interest more than just in rhetoric or some sort of token symbolic gesture, which a lot of these people, there are a lot of platitudes and cliches, but at the end of the day, they're not really fundamentally questioning how the system is structured. They're not looking at potentially a road, they're not looking towards the country in a way that is long term. It's more of a short term, what do I do and how does it affect me? It's not about like what's going to happen decades from now, and orienting the policies based on the bigger picture where it comes to sustaining the country and ensuring that the livelihoods of people from all classes isn't the equivalent of some sort of hellscape. And segueing this back into Andrew Cuomo now, this Intercept article that I'm about to read, this is actually a good time to mention how much of a hellscape a lot of this has become. And I mean, the coronavirus has been bad, the global pandemic, obviously. And I've talked about that a little bit in a previous video. But the reality has been, and it always has, is things really weren't great before the coronavirus for a lot of people. It was like 55% of Americans, if I'm not mistaken, had said during recent polls from like Pew Research and whatnot before the pandemic that they would not be able to afford, this is over half the country, 55% of people polled, an emergency expense costing $400 or more. And presumably, if that's the case, a lot of these people were living paycheck to paycheck. And now we're having at least officially 15% about unemployment rate, which I definitely think it's a lot higher, more like a quarter. We've had, during the height of the Great Recession in 2008, it was around 600, 700,000 unemployed. And that was a record number back then. Consistently now for the last 6 to 8 weeks, we've just had millions of people on a routine basis now being applying for unemployment, which meant that they just recently lost their jobs. And these aren't just working or, the lower income class people. These are also middle class people that had jobs that were not essential and couldn't be done remotely. And obviously, this is something that is just for so many people just completely uprooted how they've lived, and it has caused such tremendous economic chaos where millions of people now, I think a fifth of the country, they're not food secure. There are people right now who are going to sleep hungry, and a lot of people, millions, across the country, in particular in California, which are homeless. And they don't really have a way to social distance or, just they can't just stay home because they don't even really have a home to go to. And these are all things that, some people will claim are just a matter of these people aren't responsible, or they're just, lazy, or some sort of, way to just generalize and not really understand that the economic health of this country has now for decades, and this includes Democrats and Republicans, been just completely just in like a disaster zone. Starting from the 90s, even beforehand though, Reagan and H.W. Bush were pretty bad, but Bill Clinton in 1994 with NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, this deal had completely just dismantled the manufacturing industry that made the United States a superpower to begin with. And the companies in this country which had been able to become these big, mega corporations, a lot of them had unfortunately outsourced because of NAFTA. This trade agreement had empowered these companies to, despite basing their success off of America, a lot of them being American companies, this incentivized them to become ruthless multinational entities that just are completely only interested in their own profits and interest, and the interests are revolve around their profits mostly. And this had, obviously, because of all the new regulations and I think workers' rights, which are a good thing, obviously one of the more positive developments to come out of the 20th century. And this had led to a lot of these companies wanting to make sure that their bottom line wasn't hurt, despite now having to follow rules and having to treat workers like they're actually human beings and not just, just lifeless automatons meant to just enrich their pockets and just create, financial transactions, economic transactions that will just make these people, obviously even richer than they already are. These companies would rather not do obviously that, so they decided to outsource most of their manufacturing to countries like China and Mexico, and other countries too, obviously, India, Vietnam, some other places. All these countries do not really have the same workers' rights that this country does, and thus these companies here can then, pay these workers over there slave wages, essentially, cents on the dollar, and and just, obviously that's just clearly exploitation. But beyond the fact that it's exploitive to these people over there, it's depriving millions of people here, the blue collar class that in the past, I mean, I remember my father telling me, my grandfather, he used to be able to create wooden desks and carve them out. And he was, I guess, in a way, kind of a carpenter. And so was my uncle, actually. And that was, I mean, the United States for a long time. A lot of the working class people had built most of the things that had been here infrastructure wise during the 20th century, during the New Deal, and during the aftermath of World War II. These jobs now are just not here anymore. And one of the biggest problems when it's come to the coronavirus is the lack of self-reliance that the United States has had. And this lack of self-reliance is derived in the fact that this country doesn't make its own stuff anymore. 80% of the medical equipment comes from China. And how many things even in my own apartment here that just are probably made in China or not even made in this country. And that is at the detriment of both the peoples of the countries that we're talking about and the detriment of the Americans here, whom many of which had been displaced. And I mean, suicide rates, depression, opioid addiction, all these things are rising, and it's become the number one cause of death. I mean, I actually have a family member who overdosed himself, and it's just something that I don't think anyone should have to go through, but has become more of a norm for millions of people here. And you have to ask yourself, as tragic as it is, why are these things happening? And I think that when we ask ourselves these questions, and we're willing to actually be introspective and maybe, explore topics and issues that are controversial and are not really comfortable, and are, if anything, they are kind of for the faint of heart, not, something that they're going to ever want to look into. But for those who are really willing to try to change and are wanting to have a better America, a country which actually can reform and maybe take away lessons from this pandemic and, build a better future for the people here, instead of just being this kind of oligarchy where the rich people basically just buy out the politicians with campaign contributions, due to things like Citizens United. And then these politicians are just representatives for these different multinational interests, both domestically and foreign interests as well, that have big enough pockets to bribe these people. The constituents that these people are supposed to represent have largely been left neglected. And these are both the Democrats and the Republicans. And I think that's, at the end of the day, at the heart of why, we're in the problem that we're in right now. And unfortunately, when it comes to the possible solutions, it seems that those who are in charge of the governing these states individually, and also the federal government as well, regardless of their party affiliation, are largely providing solutions that just are short-term, or if anything, make the problems even worse. I think Andrew Cuomo, in this particular instance with this article, which I'm going to read now because I've definitely been off on a tirade, but I think it all links together here and puts things into perspective. So, the Green New Deal. Under cover of mass death, Andrew Cuomo calls in the billionaires to build a high-tech dystopia. And that is the caption, the byline of this article. It was by Naomi Klein, published on May 8th, 2020 at 12:50 p.m. There'll be a link to it in the video description below. It's a really interesting article, and I definitely recommend that you guys go check it out. But here it is. For a few fleeting moments during New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's daily coronavirus briefing on Wednesday, the somber grimace that had filled our screens for weeks was briefly replaced by something resembling a smile. We are all ready. We're all in, the governor gushed. We are New Yorkers, so we're aggressive about it. We're ambitious about it. We realize that change is not only imminent, but it can actually be a friend if done in the right way. Sounds like another platitude, but I guess fundamentally what he's saying could arguably be true, but it definitely matters context-wise what he's talking about, like what kind of change. There's good changes and there's bad changes, and it depends on what change you're talking about. And obviously, he's very vague, and he's like, oh, yeah, I'm a New Yorker, this type of thing. Politicians trying to be relatable at the end of the day, that type of shit. But, we're all used to it, obviously. But now, going back to the article, the inspiration for these uncharacteristically good vibes was a video visit from former Google CEO Eric Schmidt. Oh, so I think Larry Page is actually the CEO. My bad. Google CEO Eric Schmidt was the first CEO. And this is the guy, I believe, he had like a cold or something multiple times. And because of these colds, he had this rare condition where he lost his voice temporarily, or I guess has trouble with his windpipe or something. I mean, that's obviously bad, but I mean, he's obviously super duper rich. I'm sure he has the best healthcare money he could buy, and he's actually not the CEO anymore. Larry Page is. So that's my bad from earlier. But let's go back to this actually. Visiting from former Google CEO Eric Schmidt, who joined the governor's briefing to announce that he will be heading up a blue ribbon commission to reimagine New York State's post-COVID reality, with an emphasis on permanently integrating technology into every aspect of civil life. The first priorities of what we're trying to do, Schmidt said, are focused on telehealth, remote learning, and broadband. And that's something I previously mentioned, but obviously, yeah. We need to look for solutions that can be presented now and accelerated and use technology to make things better. Lest there be any doubt that the former Google chair's goals were purely benevolent, which his video background featured a framed pair of golden angel wings. Oh my God. This is definitely a postmodern timeline that we're in. These people, honestly, are kind of characters of what you would expect in like a fictional version of what the world was. And unfortunately, reality has been crazier than fiction. But yeah, let's go back to the article. Just one day earlier, Cuomo had announced a similar partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to develop, quote, a smarter education system, end quote. Calling Gates a quote-unquote visionary, Cuomo said the pandemic has created a moment in history when we can actually incorporate and advance Gates's ideas, all of these buildings, all these physical classrooms. Why, with all the technology you have, he asked, apparently rhetorically. And that's just him kind of kissing, like one elitist kissing another elitist ass. I mean, and Bill Gates, honestly, there's some silver linings with him. But at the end of the day, we have to remember that this guy, how the way he ran Microsoft was definitely efficient, but he was like Steve Jobs in a way, which he's kind of an asshole. And I mean, listen, you got to look into him. I can talk about him in another video altogether. He's this intelligent dude, but is not someone I think that anyone should just kind of blindly trust or assume just because of his status or wealth is going to, just be completely benevolent, like the article said, and point us in the right direction. We definitely need to be skeptical, especially with the current billionaire who is president that clearly had mishandled the crisis. I think we need less billionaires in general having just out like disproportionate political influence. They should have just as much political influence as any other regular person who can't buy a private jet or a yacht. We don't want to have a country where this like ivory tower elitist class is just kind of looking down at us. People like Nancy Pelosi who eats ice cream on these like these late night talk shows, and even like the Republicans as well, with people like Mitt Romney who have a parking garage that is like bigger than any house that I've been in, honestly, let alone the apartment, the small 1-bedroom bathroom that I'm living in. But I digress. I mean, these guys are all kind of out of touch. We already knew that. So let's go back to the article. It has taken some time to gel, but something resembling a coherent pandemic shock doctrine is beginning to emerge. Call it the Green New Deal. Far more high-tech than anything we have seen during previous disasters, the future that is being rushed into, being as the bodies still pile up treats our past weeks of physical isolation, not as a painful necessity to save lives, but as a live laboratory for a permanent and highly profitable, no-touch future. Anja Sonaker, CEO of SteerTech, a Maryland-based company selling self-parking technology. Oh, that's interesting. Recently summed up the new virus-personalized pitch. There has been a distinct warming up to a humanless, contactless technology, she said. Humans are biohazards. Machines are not. It is a future in which our homes are never again exclusively personal spaces, but are also via high-speed digital connectivity, our schools, our doctor's offices, our gyms, and if determined by the state, our jails. Of course, for many of us, those same homes are already turning into our never-off workplaces and our primary entertainment venues before the pandemic, and surveillance incarceration in the community was already booming. But in the future under hasty construction, all these trends are poised for a warp speed acceleration. This is a future in which, for the privileged, almost everything is home delivered, either virtually via streaming and cloud technology, or physically via driverless vehicle or drone, then screen shared on a mediated platform. It's a future that employs far fewer teachers, doctors, and drivers. It accepts no cash or credit cards under guise of virus control and has skeletal mass transit and far less live art. It's a future that claims to be run on artificial intelligence, but is actually held together by tens of millions of anonymous workers tucked away in warehouses, data centers, content moderation mills, electronic sweatshops, lithium mines, industrial farms, meat processing plants, and prisons, where they are left unprotected from disease and hyper-exploitation. It's a future in which our every move, our every word, our every relationship is trackable, traceable, and data mineably by unprecedented collaborations between data mineable, by any unprecedented collaborations between governments and tech giants. If all of this sounds familiar, it's because pre-COVID, this precise app-driven, gig-fueled future was being sold to us in the name of convenience, frictionlessness, and personalization. But many of us had concerns about the security, quality, and inequity of telehealth and online classrooms, about driverless cars mowing down pedestrians, and drones smashing packages and people, about location tracking and cash-free commerce obliterating our privacy and entrenching racial and gender discrimination, about unscrupulous social media platforms poisoning our information ecology and our kids' mental health, about smart cities filled with sensors supplanting local government, about good jobs these technologies wiped out, about the bad jobs they mass-produced. And most of all, we had concerns about the democracy-threatening wealth and power accumulated by a handful of tech companies that are masters of abdication, eschewing all responsibility for the wreckage left behind in the fields they now dominate, whether media, retail, or transportation. That was the ancient past known as February. Today, a great many of those well-founded concerns are being swept away by a tidal wave of panic, and this warmed over dystopia is going through a rush job rebranding. Now, against the harrowing backdrop of mass death, it is being sold to us on the dubious promise that these technologies are the only possible way to pandemic-proof our lives, the indispensable key to keeping ourselves and our loved ones safe. Thanks to Cuomo and his various billionaire partnerships, including one with Michael Bloomberg for testing and tracing, New York State is being positioned as the gleaming showroom for this grim future, but the ambitions reach far beyond the borders of any state or country. And at the dead center of it all is Eric Schmidt. Well before Americans understood the threat of COVID-19, Schmidt had been on an aggressive lobbying and public relations campaign, pushing precisely the Black Mirror vision of society. Black Mirror is a Netflix original if you guys aren't familiar with it. And it's an interesting series, which I do recommend you guys check out. Not everything on Netflix is good, but I definitely think that one in particular, especially that Bandicoot, Choose Your Own Adventure sub-series was actually really interesting. But I digress. Vision of society that Cuomo has just empowered him to build. At the heart of this vision is seamless integration of government with a handful of Silicon Valley giants, with public, hospitals, doctors, offices, police, and military all outsourcing at high cost many of their core functions to private tech companies. It's a vision Schmidt had been advancing in his roles as chair of the Defense Innovation Board, which advises the Department of Defense on increased use of artificial intelligence in the military, and as chair of the powerful National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, or NSCAI, which advises Congress on advances in artificial intelligence, related machine learning developments, and associated technologies, with the goal of addressing the, quote, the national and economic security needs of the United States, including economic risk, end quote. Both boards are crowded with powerful Silicon Valley CEOs and top executives from companies including Oracle, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and of course, Schmidt's colleagues at Google. And obviously, this is actually a relatively lengthy article, which clearly, I think, looking at the time, I thought I would actually be under the 15-minute mark when this was being read, but it's about at the 30 minutes, and I don't want to, go over 45, 50 minutes, which is the limit for the webcam recording app that I'm using. So I'm actually going to link the rest of this in the description, but you guys definitely get the idea. And it's a really bad one. And it's one that I think that we should all take the time to really consider and maybe, try to show that we're not all on board with this. And this is something that I particularly have an interest in as someone who grew up in New York, who has family, my whole entire family's up there, and visits it often enough where this coronavirus for sure has caused a lot of people to panic. And no crisis has ever gone without a handful of unscrupulous, mostly politically oriented people using it as an opportunity to prey on people's fears and then use it as the justification for consolidating their powers, which in normal circumstances would not be something that would be seen favorably or even probably allowed. And this has been something that has happened throughout history, but in particular with coronavirus and the global pandemic that we're now all in. This brave new frontier, brave new world, I guess, in lack of a better term, that we're in, is something that has incentivized things that had already been going in motion to basically accelerate. And this is leading now towards really one of those, we look at the Twilight Zone in the past. My dad loved that show, actually. My dad loves that show, and I watched it with him. And it's a sci-fi, kind of horror show in a way where it shows these dystopian alternate realities. And this future that's being described in this article is nothing short of a nightmare and a hellscape. And we really need to reconsider whether or not we're going to put our fate in the hands of these technocrats whom really are convinced in some ways that they're kind of larger than life and that it's their destiny it's kind of like the divine right of kings, like they believe due to their status that they are the ones who are going to craft and orient these new ways going forward of how we're going to run society. We got to remember, these people aren't saints. They're not deities. They are humans just like us. They have flaws, and for all their wealth and status, they are just as powerless when it comes to this crisis. They could all catch coronavirus, and a lot of them are getting older, so a lot of them could probably die from it too, which just goes to show how fragile everything really is. And if anything, that should be more of an incentive for us to sit down, be very introspective, and really consider how we're going to go forward. And this is coming from someone who doesn't really see himself on the left or the right politically in America. I'm an independent voter, and I'm somebody who I think wants to hold both the Democrats and the Republicans accountable. Policy-wise, you can ask me at any point, and I'm definitely going to have future videos where I'll talk about other stuff where I'll be making my ideology gradually more clear. But when it comes to your party affiliation, that should not mean whether or not the current government and the people who are in charge of oversight, that shouldn't be changing how they operate. Everyone should be accountable, especially the government, and allowing these technocrats to just allow the government having these private corporations just orient how we're going to go forward, how millions of people are going to be educated. And then at the same time, with these private prisons, which continue to exist in New York, obviously part of that area too with the problem, and these companies which obviously have certain jobs that can't have social distancing. This is going to create a very, very this is basically a form of neo-feudalism. It's a way to segregate based off of economic class. And I mean, most of that is tied also race due to the historical inequities and whatnot. But this is something that's going to really, if you think about WALL-E and the Twilight Zone, these movies, this is one of the first things that come to my mind, in the sense that we're all really becoming increasingly in our own bubbles and echo chambers. We're disconnected from other people, especially those that really don't have the same worldview or origins as us, even though most of these people, along with people like myself and people watching this, we're all in the same world. We're all in the same country. And I mean, there's people in the United States, and we're all kind of, as cliche as it is, we're all in this together, but not in the way that these corporations have kind of turned that into a cliche. Reality is these companies are more about symbolic gestures. And when I say we're all in this together, it's not like, oh, this lovey-dovey, let's get together, unite, and we'll all be great, and this will just be something like, kumbaya. Reality is we're all in this in the sense that we're all getting fucked right now. And I think that this is just a bad situation that I think we really need to pump the brakes, just sit down and really think how we're going to go forward. If anything, this crisis should show that we need long-term planning and a kind of oversight, like holding accountable the people who are in charge, and the level of incompetence that every level of government, including Cuomo and de Blasio, the mayor of New York, and the governor and the mayor of New York respectively, which when this first was coming out, that the first cases were coming out in Wuhan, and then the first diagnosis, which apparently was not potentially the first case as it was traveling around the virus. There was a collective, just myopic response when it comes to how we handle this pandemic. The national strategic stockpile had been neglected both by the Trump and the Obama administration for, despite having Ebola and SARS having been a thing since when I was growing up and as a student in the NYC education system. I mean, this is just on so many levels like a dystopian country that the United States has become. And I mean, it's sad because there's a lot of squandered opportunities and a lot of potential that could have been something that, different. And I think that this crisis, the pandemic, obviously is no human, it's no human error. It's the product, obviously, of the Chinese government not regulating their wet markets, and then a freak natural natural storm, like the perfect storm, where this bat or whatever these people were eating that should have been regulated and not been eating, these bats, whatever this thing was able to transmit this disease, which was not normally something that humans have ever interfaced with up until this point. That's why it was called the novel coronavirus. Novel in the sense that it was a novelty up until recently. And COVID-19 obviously meant that the year it started was in 2019. And now they're saying that this could have potentially been a thing since November or even like October. I mean, really, who the fuck knows? And it's just the fact that when it came to this country, the United States government had really just not taken any precautions or really taken the news. It sounds like from what I heard that Trump outright was kind of just in denial and assumed that it just wouldn't come here. When the reality is, because of how we've created the society and how trade deals and all these other free trade deals, all these other multinational, just the corporatization of this country, honestly, the bureaucracy and corporations have completely just intertwined themselves together. And developments such as the ones with Andrew Cuomo bringing the former CEO of Google, just encapsulates that. And it's something which both parties have basically just co-signed themselves to allowing and enabling in so many different ways. And it's something that really is causing one of the broader symptoms of this broader problem that coronavirus has just kind of magnified and has really put this more into the perspective as millions of people continue to file for unemployment and people's lives as they knew it seem like they'll probably never be the same. I don't think that things are ever going to go back to what was perceived personally prior to this as normal. Anyone who really thinks like that at this point needs to just kind of wake up, because this situation is far from all right. And even before coronavirus, this wasn't all right to begin with. Millions of people have been homeless. 27 million people before this million Americans were uninsured or underinsured. And now there's probably way even more because of middle-class people being unemployed and their employers the standard in America, unfortunately, has been that your healthcare has been tied to your employer. And that's really just another corporate mechanism for consolidating control. As, for example, now these private insurance companies, which really don't need to exist. This single-payer healthcare system really is the only model forward if we're really going to take having an actual healthcare system that is people-oriented, not just derived from the interest of the profits of these healthcare and pharmaceutical lobbies, which are really just gangs that wear suits. I mean, these are just criminals that wear suits and are able to use the law to basically legalize criminal behavior that would any society was interested that having a government that represented the common good. These guys would have been either executed or thrown in prison for what they've been doing. They've been ripping off millions of people. And as a result, now we have tons of people underinsured, uninsured, and a pandemic in which not millions, thousands, but hopefully not millions. I mean, who knows with how incompetent this has been. And if as things are reopening kind of prematurely, who knows how bad this is going to get. But compared to the amount of cases worldwide, the United States is at least about a third of the entire world, despite the fact that this is supposed to be a country more like Western Europe than Central America, more like a, first world country than this kind of just, banana republic response, which is comparable to some of the countries with the worst responses, like Turkmenistan, where you're jailed for criticizing or even mentioning the coronavirus. They're trying to pretend like it doesn't exist. Or even like Brazil, where Jair Bolsonaro, this guy, who I'm pretty sure had his competitor, who was probably going to win again, this former president, I think, of Brazil, arrested. And this person had to run for president while they were in prison. And then obviously they didn't win. And then Bolsonaro became president. He has not only been chopping down the Amazon and allowing private corporations to essentially build farms and do whatever they want over there, he has also been just horrible to the indigenous people of Brazil. And beyond all that, he has also just been completely negligent when it came to the country's handling of the pandemic. And obviously, I mean, listen, I don't think we are at the bottom of the barrel here, but the fact that we're even comparing ourselves to these countries, we need to set higher standards. We need to have a better standard when it comes to what we're going to expect from the quality of leadership. We need to stop electing entertainers, and we need to start putting people in charge whom actually are going to represent the common interest. And in a situation like this, have not just kind of allowed Congress to go on vacation as for weeks, paid vacation, where they don't have to pay for the travel back and forth of the vacation. It's all subsidized with our tax dollars, as millions of people right now are going to sleep hungry, and a lot of people, including myself, are struggling just to make ends meet. And I think that that's something that we all need to take into consideration, and it's something that we need to really self-reflect on. Because at the end of the day, as much as it might suck to admit it, and for some people to not want to accept this, we're all responsible at the end of the day for how the government operates, as we're unknowingly electing these people and not holding the ones who should be held accountable to account. And we need to start electing people not like Trump, not like Biden, not like Cuomo, whom are just going to basically leave the future of all of our children, grandchildren, even ourselves to, and our grandparents. I mean, all of the people that make this country what it is. We shouldn't be leaving their fate in the hands of private technocratic elites like Bezos and the Waltons and other multinational corporations and the people who own them. We also shouldn't be electing people who are going to try to just further divide and turn this country into just socially isolated kind of, technocratic hellscape, where maybe we can get our food delivered and, not have to leave our houses, which is something I'm not sure about you guys, but I love to go out. I mean, I like to hike. I like nature. I don't think staying inside all day is something anyone should want to do. And I think that one of the things I do personally miss about the pandemic, I mean, not the pandemic, but the life before the pandemic, was the fact that I in particular live in the downtown area of Tampa, where if you go out on any real day, like around this time of the year, usually you're able to interact with so many people who are friendly, and there's a lot of opportunities and things to do, like events going on in the parks. And now it's just as things slowly try to come back to this quasi sense of normality that some people are desperately trying to grasp onto, even though times have clearly moved on, and we can't really just be wasting our collective energies being anachronistic. I think we need to start, obviously, seriously considering what we're going to do going forward. And politically, we need to all keep ourselves informed and try to be as aware of what's going on, and then, mobilize and do tangible things. And if you agree, hopefully you do at the end of all this, leave your comments down below. I'm curious to hear what your opinions are. And hopefully you guys had enjoyed this video, which is really, if anything, just a webcast, I guess a video podcast, in the sense that I've talked for a long time. And I mean, I definitely went off on several tirades, but hopefully overall you guys are able to derive benefit from this. And in the future, obviously, I'll have more content coming out. Go subscribe, youtube.com/GetNuanced. Follow me on social media, and let me know what you guys think. I really appreciate everything, all these, all the people commenting recently, and also the fact that people are at least just stopping by and hearing some random perspectives. I mean, I'm just some random person on the internet, as are most of you guys watching this, guys and gals, I guess. And I hope that beyond just me essentially just going on and bantering, that going forward, hopefully there will be a brighter future. It's hard to see one now, but I think maybe there's a chance. But we got to start changing things, and we've got to start looking at ourselves and realizing that these political leaders are a reflection also of society and the apathy and lack of interest in topics such as history, politics and whatnot. And we need to increase those interests. And the sooner we do, the better. But otherwise, thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys next video. I make soon. Peace out.